Kareem. Amma ba'd. We are now going on to the third main section of Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi's الاقتصاد في الاعتقاد القطب الثالث في أفعال الله تعالى. So we are discussing the divine actions, so the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we claim وندعي في هذا القطب بسبعة أمور. So he will make 7 claims here, 7 theological claims. So all acts of Allah are permissible, jaiz, and they are not wajib in any rational or moral sense. So we are going to discuss this is sort of like the Yuthrow's dilemma, where we are questioning whether Allah, he commands things because they are good in and of themselves. So is he working against a standard external to himself, or are they simply arbitrary, and are they commands because he simply wills them? And we are saying here, we are making this claim that all acts of Allah are permissible, jaiz, and they are not necessary in any sense. So there is no external standard forcing Allah to act in a certain way. And we will discuss this through 7 claims. And this is our ethics, the Ash'ari ethics. So Allah may choose, these 7 are, Allah may choose not to command his servants. So we believe that it could have been the case, it is logically possible for Allah not to give any commands. And this refutes the Mu'tazilite claim of rational obligation, al-luzumu al-aql. So they believe that it's necessary upon Allah to behave in a just manner. He has to always either punish or he must always reward. He cannot do otherwise. Then Allah may command someone to do the impossible, and that's logically something conceivable. Of course, we believe that Allah doesn't do this, but it's logically possible for him to have done that. And this contrasts with rational ethics as opposed to this divine command theory. Then there is God may inflict pain without compensation or cause. So Allah could have simply caused any hardship upon someone and he would not be required to compensate that hardship at all. So this rejects any intrinsic justice in suffering. The idea here is that it is an obligation upon Allah to compensate. Of course, we believe that Allah will compensate suffering and injustice. However, what we're claiming is that it is not logically necessary upon Allah to behave in such a way. So that's the main claim. So some of these might appear to be somewhat confusing, as in the Islamic tradition, we do believe that Allah compensates hardship and suffering. But we are making the claim here that it isn't a necessary obligation upon Allah to do so, just purely from a reasonable perspective and rational perspective. Fourth, God is not bound to act for what is best for his creation. He does not have to do what is best for creation. He simply can create for whatever purpose or reason he wishes. So this rejects some principle which were coming from this Mu'tazila idea of rational utility, and Allah can reward, and his rewards and punishments are not rationally obligatory. So this rejects a consequentialist or merit-based divine justice. An obligation is not rational, only revelatory. So the reason that we must act and must believe in Allah and must perform certain rituals is not something we would know if Allah did not reveal this to us. So there are some other schools who believe that it is necessary upon people to at least believe if no revelation has been delivered to them. But the Ash'ari position is otherwise, that it is not necessary. And finally, sending prophets was not something that God had to have done. It wasn't something that he was obligated to do. He did do it, but it wasn't necessary upon him to do this. So God's acts are not conditioned by human need or rational expectation. So what Imam Ghazali does is conceptual analysis of moral language. So first he says it looks at the word wajib, which is obligatory. It has multiple meanings depending on the context. When we think of it with regards to a modal or ontological perspective, then it is referring to a necessary being, and we say Allah is wajib in the sense that He is wajibul wujud. So these are important distinctions that he makes now, because before he was saying that it wasn't wajib upon Allah to behave in certain ways. But what is the word? So he thinks it is necessary now. Well, pardon the pun. It is very important for him to define what he means by wajib, and he is saying here and outlining that wajib can only mean a few things. It either means necessary being, so this corresponds to modal necessity, so an existence that cannot be, or when we say wajib, it can mean and apply a sort of empirical or causal necessity. And we said this before, it's like a logical necessity, like a person can't fit through a door which is too narrow for him. That's just logically necessary. So logical absurdities in there. And then there are moral and religious obligations. So this is what we are discussing in this context. So what reason identifies as harmful to omit? This is a natural necessity. And what revelation identifies as harmful to omit? This is a moral or religious necessity. So what we define as wajib here are those things that if they were not there, then they would lead to severe harm, especially in the afterlife. So this is different to a rationalist moral realism. So we are moral relativists in the sense that we don't believe that morals exist out there somewhere. And then the term also is hasan, which means good, and there's also the term qabih, which means evil or ugly. So we have relativist and subjective definitions, because we observe that acts are good or bad according to the goals or interests of the agent or observer. So values aren't inherent in acts. Values are attached or associated to acts. They exist within them inherently. And so acts can either align with the person's goal. So if a person has a certain goal and the action that is carried out aligns with that goal, then some people will consider that to be hasan. If it doesn't, if it's something which is counter to him achieving his goal, then that is qabih. And if it doesn't help or harm the person, then you could call this abath, which is useless, futile. And so acts without any telos, so teleology, are irrational or theologically null. So we would ignore the third type. So then there's rational ethics. So an act may be good for one, but then relational ethics, sorry. So an act might be good for some people, but it might be considered bad from another perspective. And we can see this clearly through wars. So one country might believe that they are behaving completely morally and they are behaving justly. However, from the perspective of another country that's being attacked, then those actors are evil. And this is very clear, like that one person's terrorist is another person's hero or freedom fighter. So adultery might be seen as hasan by a liberal person, but it's qabih by a religious person. So the forms of hasan in usage, when we say hasan, something good, is, so you could say it's a general use, so something that serves good. And then there's also the religious use. So when we refer to hasan, we talk about reward in the afterlife. So divine actions are always hasan. So we will say that they are beyond blame. We can never say that Allah's actions are blameworthy. So even though Allah doesn't benefit from the actions, qabih cannot be applied to Allah. So how do we apply this to a theodicy? So people cursing time of fate as qabih are actually criticizing Allah, because Allah is the one that created all of these things. So that's why Allah says, do not curse time, for Allah is time. Hikmah. So what does wisdom mean? There's a huge discussion, of course, over this. Hikmah is used in two ways. There's the theoretical sense, where it refers to the mastery of abstract order, the teleology, the metaphysical insights of the subtle and obvious order, knowing how things ought to be achieved, their intended goals. So when we say hikmah, we refer to the proper position of things in their places, and that's what he's talking about here. So it's analogous to Aristotelian phronesis or Stoic logos, where things are correctly positioned. It's the opposite of ظلم, which is وضع شيء في غير محله, and hikmah would be وضع شيء في محله. So Practical wisdom is when the above understanding is coupled with power to create order or act with precision. Ihkam. So, what does it mean when we say Allah is the Hakim? It means that He is capable of creating an ordered and precise and structured and perfect creation. So, a person can be called Hakim because of their knowledge, and a person can also be called Hakim because of their ability to apply this knowledge. So this applies. So hikmah is a combination of both divine omnipotence and omniscience. And we have. So what are these the implications here of our of so far of what we've discussed? So we've defined some terms, and now we're discussing some implications. So in the Ash'ari theology, we hold to divine command theory, and morality is based solely on the divine will, the irada of Allah. It is not something which exists based on a rational standard out external to Allah. This contrasts with the Mu'tazila's moral rationalism, where they say values are discernible by the intellect because they exist because of something external out there. And it's also this isn't the same as the virtue ethics of the Greeks. Then you have moral relativism and perspectivism. This is what we hold to, that good and evil are not intrinsic to acts. So this is similar to Nietzsche's perspectivism, where values differ by perspective. And there's something called meta-ethical non-cognitivism, where moral statements express attitudes. So this is also part of the Ash'ari framework, where people believe things are good or bad based on their own relative perspective. And then there's a critique of rationalism in ethics. That Imam Ghazali critiques the assumption that reason can determine obligation. And this resonates with David Hume's is-ought problem. Like, how do you bridge between the is and ought problem? We know something is, for example, something is in such a way, then why is it that we ought to behave in such a way in light of that? And then there's G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy, which warns against defining good through natural properties as well. So all of this supports the Ash'ari position. So then there's a note here. Imam Ghazali advocates semantic clarity before engaging in disputation. That's why there's a lot of people, we find that they argue and discuss with each other and they speak past each other, and sometimes when we see the way that they define their terms, if they acknowledged one another's definitions, then they wouldn't even have a problem to begin with. And that's why we find that a lot of these schools of thought, like the Ash'ira and the Maturidiyya, even the Atharis to extent as well, in the beginning they all had disputes with one another, but as time passed and the scholars began to recognize each other's schools and study each other's schools, then they came to the conclusion that actually these guys are upon the haqq, but the way that they see things are just through a different perspective, or it's just the case that they are using terms differently than we are, but really we have an equivalent to what they're saying within our own schools, but we just use the term slightly differently. So it's important, as Imam Ghazali recognizes that there's ambiguity in moral language. So what his strategy is to clarify the meaning of terms before making any propositions. So the main topic is perception of good and evil, and subjectivity and error and illusions. From an Islamic perspective, philosophical, ethical lens, particularly aligning with Imam Ghazali's critique of common moral judgments. So the first mistake Imam Ghazali discusses is al-ghadh. The concept is people judge actions as al-qabih, ugly, if they contradict their own goals or interests, regardless of their values for others. So what we're talking about here is moral subjectivism, egoism, you could say. So what people make an error in is they confuse their relative harm with intrinsic evil. Just because something might cause harm to yourself from your relative perspective, that doesn't mean that it is inherently evil. For example, a person may call something evil simply because it contradicts their personal benefit, and assuming their preference is the same as universal norm. And this might be a societal as well. A society might believe that something which is beneficial to them as a people is inherently evil, but that doesn't equate or equal to a universal norm. It's self-centered, right? There's a lack of perspective from this view, and it's a failure to consider alternative viewpoints or even other dimensions of one's own self. So this resembles the critique of psychological egoism and epistemic closure. So the second mistake that people make is absolutizing what is generally harmful. So the concept of actions that are harmful in most cases are judged absolutely evil, right? But they neglect the exceptions. So they make hasty generalizations, which is a fallacy. So so an example is people might claim that lying is always evil by nature, but they ignore that sometimes it's necessary to lie to save a life. For example, you could say that you could lie when a gun's put to your head, or Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, when he lied about, well, you could say it's a white lie, it's not even really a lie, but when he lied about his wife, they say to the king, and called him his sister, and then which isn't really a lie because he meant in sister in Islam, but then there's some narrations which say that he'll be questioned because of this. So, and then the reason that people have these inherent views, which seemingly inherent, is because it is due to habitual conditioning from early education. So it's due to socialization. So, and the Prophet ﷺ spoke about this, that everyone is born upon a pure fitrah, but as they grow, their parents make them Christians and Jews, so they change them. So there is this conditioning that occurs, that nurture, they say nature versus nurture, and that paints lying as, and because of this, someone might think that lying is categorically bad or evil, even though there are cases where there are exceptions. So this ties to utilitarian ethics versus deontological ethics. So judging moral actions without context, however, leads to false making universal generalizations. The third mistake he discusses is a reverse inference and illusory association. So there's a mistaken contingent association for inherent connection. So example is, a man is bitten by a snake may fear any similarly patterned rope. So just because we view bitten by a snake which had a certain pattern on its skin, and then whenever we see a rope which has a similar pattern, we begin to fear. So people feel disgust towards yellow soft foods due to their resemblance to excrement, but that doesn't mean that yellow soft food itself is disgusting. So the names of certain ethnicities, they could also trigger biases or due to any prior negative associations. And so this is due to, he talks about a lot about human psychology here as well. So this philosophy here, human psychology. So the key insight is emotion and imagination overpower the rationality in moral judgments and even aesthetic judgments as well. And there are also, of course, social biases and sectarian biases. So even scholars fall into confirming bias and sectarian prejudice as well. For example, a person accepts a logical position until he hears that this is from an Ash'ari, then he'll reject it. So there's epistemic injustice here because of group bias. So it's kind of like an identity protective cognition. So many learned people don't transcend taqdeed blind following, they only seek arguments to justify their inherent views, and Imam Ghazali criticized this. So the true rational inquiry, the ijtihad, requires neutrality, rejecting both belief and disbelief until evidence dictates otherwise. So some people favor good with no benefits. There's an objection here. Some people do good deeds even though there are no benefits to them. So there's an example. So someone might rescue someone from drowning and they don't have any kind of benefit, and there might not be anyone around as well. And there also is the individual that refuses to utter a word of disbelief even though they are being tortured, right? And if this is even, and although the Sharia allows you to utter this word of disbelief, so fulfilling also a harmful treaty instead of breaking it for safety. So the response is, these acts are not free from interest. Rather, they just reflect deeper or more subtle psychological motives. So, for example, empathy. This is a natural aversion to witnessing suffering. So we imagine ourselves if we were in that position. So the reason that we save the person from drowning is because of our empathy. We want to alleviate this sorrow that we feel for that person, and that's a rahmah from Allah. So that's a good thing anyway. So we shouldn't disqualify that as something selfish, though. So we aren't saying that having empathy for a person makes the action selfish, but what we're saying is that the reason that we are inclined towards behaving in that manner isn't free from an interest. anticipated praise as well. So even in private settings, when we do any good, we are influenced by internalized societal values. So praise has been linked to this act, so the act becomes praiseworthy. So we might see something which is a praise, something which is generally considered good. So why are we doing this thing which is considered good? It's because praise is something which is connected to this act in society. So we are instinctively led towards and directed towards that action. And there's also habitual associations. Noble acts are habitually tied to feelings of virtue, so acting against them creates an internal discomfort. So that's also self-interest. So Imam Ghazali's own model is one where there is the nafs, which responds to the waham, the imagination. So the nafs responds to the imagination more than it does to the akal, the intellect. Sometimes we love like houses and places, and this is because they are associated to something which we love, like a certain wall of a house or a garden where there's a trees. We love these things specifically. Like people, our Rumi says people love their homelands because they recall their childhood pleasures, and that we have some kind of intimate connection and relationship and memories associated with those things. That's why we have love for them. So moral judgments are not rationally grounded, but are based on memory, nostalgia, emotion, and sensory associations. And this supports moral psychology that ethical perceptions are tied to psycho-emotional constructs, not simply through reason. So the conclusion is human behavior is driven by whims and associations, and imagination and sensory responses dominate. For example, when we imagine food, we salivate, or when you imagine someone that you're attracted to, you are beloved, you might feel arousal. So these reactions persist despite rational awareness that action might be permissible or impermissible. So you might feel hungry even though you're fasting. So core message is humans are puppets of habit, association, and imagination unless they are spiritually elevated. And also, even a person that does good deeds for the sake of Allah, they are doing it for the sake of Allah, or and that Allah will, that they would the self-interest there is that they want Allah's attention, or they want reward in the hereafter. We're going to go more deeper now. So Allah is not obligated to create or impose moral duties. So that was the first claim that we said. So Allah can choose not to create. If He creates, this act is not necessary. If He creates, and it's not something which He had to have done, it's not necessary upon Him. If He creates humans, He does not necessarily have to impose any moral responsibility upon them. If He does do it, it's not because He necessarily has to. Whereas the Mu'tazila would say that He has to do so, and they say that the Khalif, which is moral responsibility, is imposed upon creation for their own benefit. So Imam Ghazali argues against this. So once again, he refers back to his definition of obligation, wujub, and he said there were only three valid meanings. So avoiding harm. So just a reminder, it was avoiding harm, darar, for the agent, either immediate or eventual. Or it was a logical necessity, so its negation implies contradiction. Or it was a pre-existing divine rule or knowledge necessitating its occurrence. So Allah's so something wajib can also refer to that which is necessary, because Allah's existence is necessary and Allah's knowledge is necessary. So those things which occur because of those things which will occur because of His knowledge must occur, because nothing can contradict His knowledge. So all of three of these things are inapplicable to Allah. So remember that. So we're saying that something might be morally obligated upon a being is because they might want to avoid harm, and Allah cannot be harmed. So the first one is ruled out. A logical necessity, its negation implies contradiction. Allah, and this, of course, isn't applicable to Allah, because Allah, His power, it only it fulfills those things which are possible, and impossible things. When we talk about contradictions, those are things which are not correct based on the sentence structure or the actual meaning of the words. And of course, the divine knowledge, Allah, it's part of His own essence anyway. And then you could also say that Allah cannot be harmed and negates the first point, and not creating or not obligating entails no contradictions. So that negates two. So it's not logically necessary. So when you define wajib as being logically necessary, it's not logically necessary upon Allah to create, because no contradictions would arise if Allah chose not to create or to create. Also, only if Allah's eternal will pertains to an act does it become necessary. So that's why so the point three exists. It's true for Allah, but that's because it's part of Allah's essence, or it exists within Allah's essence. So there's another claim that Allah must create because of the benefit to creation, and then the rebuttal to this is you're using a theological goal-oriented argument, but wajib must be established first, right? You have to say that this is which definition of wujub are you using, and how are you establishing this for Allah, that Allah must create. So benefit for creation is not the same as saying that it's a moral obligation on Allah, since Allah gains nothing from anyone doing any good deeds. Everyone knows this. Every Muslim believes in this. That regardless of what we do, Allah won't benefit from any of this. And the Quran supports this as well. God is not subject also to consequentialist ethics. By his definition of good, there is some benefit to the actor, okay, directly or psychologically, and none of these apply to Allah. Because what we define good as something which benefits the actor, either directly or psychologically, and of course, there's nothing which benefits Allah from our actions. So, therefore, good in this sense doesn't apply to Allah. That Allah doing anything, Allah must do something because it's good, doesn't apply to Allah. And there's a distinction between creation and taklif. So even if there's a benefit in being created, it doesn't entail obligation for Allah. So creation in paradise might seem beneficial because it's eternal bliss and there's no suffering. This doesn't entail that it was necessary for Allah to create it. Then the human condition, remember that when we look at the existent creation, we see that the human condition includes pain, suffering, there are tests. The prophets and the saints, they were like Maryam alayhi salam, she made the dua kuntu nasiya mansiya, that she wished that she could be ever forgotten because of the pain. They said things like they wished they were dust or they wished they were a bird. So this actual creation appears, Imam Ghazali says, more harmful than beneficial. So this contradicts any kind of utilitarian claim regarding Allah creating because of good. And then moral responsibility, taklif, is by definition a burden, right? Which is a type of suffering. So to say it is for the benefit of humans is kind of self-defeating. That taklif is something which Allah does. Allah created us for our benefit, and He put upon us these responsibilities for our own benefit. But taklif itself is a burden, which means to suffer somewhat. So although there might be a greater goal at the end, because there might be something to gain at the end, but it is still suffering by definition. So someone might argue in response that the reward is worth the obligation because no pain, no gain. So the claim is reward, the thawab justifies the hardship, the reward earned is sweeter. The rebuttal is Allah could have given the same reward, right, as a gift. He desiring to earn the reward implies arrogance. So if you say that you are entitled to this reward, then that's a kind of arrogance, and true believers should accept Allah's grace over like the entitlement, because it's arrogant. It isn't be befitting of the creation to think this way. Believer. Okay, so that was the first claim, and now we're going to the second claim, and we'll discuss this next time, inshallah. Wa alhamdulillah rabbil alamin.